Well, we're continuing in Isaiah chapter 9, and we're looking at the gift of the Son. So when we looked at the background, we saw really that what is happening is the Son is the answer to the turmoil that is going on in the world. And the Son is presented as the spiritual solution to the physical turmoil. And as we've said previously, with prophecy, there's often a past, a present, and a future fulfillment to come. So the promise of the Son means that we need to look at what the other biblical writers and prophecies have to say about the sonship of Messiah. Can't look at all of them, but I will focus in on a couple and see what the New Testament has to say about their fulfillment. I love the fact that Mark's gospel opens with God's plan. Mark 1:1. In the beginning of the good news of Yeshua the Messiah, the Son of God, Ben Elohim. You see, he makes this sweeping introduction, and the angel is speaking to Miriam to prophesy the birth of her son. But the birth of the Son is the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. So let's take a little romp through some of the prophecies and see what might have been in Mark's mind when he opens his gospel in this way. For me, I always end up, for some obscure reason, in Proverbs 30, verse 4. And in Proverbs 30, verse 4, he's asking a question that was also asked by the prophet Isaiah. Who has measured the waters? Isaiah 40, verse 12. Who's measured them in the palm of his hand? Or measured the heaven with a span? Or calculated the dust of the earth in a measure? Or weighed the mountains in scales or the hills in balance? Well, the writer in Proverbs in chapter 30, verse 4 goes even further. He asks, who has gone up into heaven and come down? Who has gathered the wind in the palm of his hand, or wrapped up the waters in a cloak? Who has established the ends of the earth? What is his name? This is what the writer asks. And then he adds something further. He said, and what is the name of his son, if you know? Now, I love this. It's a prophecy that makes this declaration. Who did the work? What is his name? And then he asks a prophetic question. What is the name of his son? Of course, we approach this from the perspective of knowing the answer. We see what the writer to Proverbs could not see, what he could not imagine, and that is the firstborn Son of God. And so it's an exciting question that is asked. But it connects to lots more in the New Testament. You see, the Son here is identified with the Creator as being involved in the work of creation. And in a very real sense, that makes him equal with the Creator. And of course, I'm sure we all jump straight to John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. Nothing was made without him. And that's exciting. In Colossians 1, verse 15, the apostle writes that he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions, rulers or authorities. All things were created through him. And then I love this, all things were created for him. And in him, all things hold together. You see, the work of the Son is essential. The writer to Hebrews in chapter 1, verse 3 will actually say that the Son is the one who upholds the universe by the word of his power. In the beginning was the Word. It is the Word that upholds everything through the powerful word of the Messiah. And what's more, he sits at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Hebrews 1 verse 3. I guess if we're having a romp through scripture and prophecy, we have to consider Micah 5 verses 1 to 3. Again, if we start at verse 2, we read, "But as for you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, too little to be known among the clans of Judah. From you will come one will go forth for me to be a ruler in Israel. His goings from forth are from long ago, from days of eternity. Therefore he will give them up until the time when she who is in labor has borne a child." And here we have this prophecy about a child that will be born. He will be born in Bethlehem. And this well-known prophecy given 700 years before Yeshua was born was given to Miriam. And although the word son is not specifically mentioned, it's implied, because the woman will give birth to a child who has existed from eternity. This son who will be born has an eternal nature, something that can only belong to God himself. But this verse in Micah is quoted in Matthew chapter 2, verse 6. And it's always worth having a quick look. So I'm going to open up Matthew chapter 2. And in verse 6, we read, "But you, O Bethlehem in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is or who will be the shepherd of my people Israel." It was really at this point that Herod is summoning the wise men, and he wants to know more about what is happening. And of course, it was the Magi, the wise men who are coming from the east, who asked the question, "Where is he who has been born the King of the Jews? For we saw his star. It rose and we have come to worship him." And so they understood that this son who would be born is one who will be king and one to whom worship is due. And that is quite an interesting thing, because it doesn't talk about him being born as a prince. It literally is saying that from the moment of his birth, his kingship has been established. And that's because his kingship was promised. And that's because his kingship already exists in heaven. In Matthew 2:11, again, we see this deity being pointed at, this nature of who he is. And because they go to Miriam, they fall down and they worship him, and they bring him treasures. Now, that was an ancient tradition. When you went to visit a king, if you were sent as an emissary or an ambassador, you took with you gifts. Last weekend, was it the weekend before? I get confused with my weekends and dates. We were looking at the Haftarah portion, which was the story of Naaman. And Naaman is the Syrian general who is struck with leprosy. And the king of Syria, Aram, writes a letter to the king of Israel asking for healing. And of course, Naaman comes with a huge amount of gold to be offered to the king. And as soon as the king doesn't receive him, but he's sent to the prophet Elisha, because Elisha has heard about the distress of the king, it says, don't worry about it. Send him to me. I'll sort it. And so Naaman comes with all the gifts, which of course Elisha refuses. So this was ancient tradition. You took gifts of money and silver and gold and everything that was precious and offered them to the king. And this is what we see in Matthew 11. They come, they fall on their knees, and they offer the gifts that are due to the king. And that is a precious and exciting thought for us, because we can see what the writer in the Proverbs could not see. We can see the Son of God, Yeshua, having been born, and the one to whom worship must be given. And of course, that's really at the heart of our prophecy tonight in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6-7. A child will be born to us. A son will be given. And then we go on to read about what this son will do, how he will carry the authority that God has given. Government will rest upon him. And then we read about his names, and we'll be looking at his names next week. But this son is also God. His deity is pointed at. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, and Prince of Peace. He is the one who will rule over all. And some people see in this prophecy an allusion to Revelation chapter 19 and verse 16, where we read this. Revelation 19, verse 16. And on his robe and on his thigh, he has a name that is written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So the king, this one who has been born, is not born to be a prince. He's born to be a king. And some of his divine rulership that exists in heaven will be manifest on the earth through his birth. And of course, as we've been going through our Tuesday nights, we keep coming back to the prophecy in 2 Samuel 7, verse 14, where David and his son is alluded to. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. And of course, the promise of sonship that is given to David is also about the throne, the eternal throne that God will promise to him. And this promise about God being father to him is quoted in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 5. So a quick look at that, Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 5. For to which of the angels did God ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you? Or again, I will be to him a father, and he will be to me a son. And we'll look at the first part of that prophecy in a moment, but we're just thinking at the moment about the Davidic sonship. And when we compare the wider context of what God is saying in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 14, we see that if we look at other references, it's obvious that the only one who could fulfill the prophecy is Yeshua, Jesus, the Son of God. And that's the prophecy that Mark opens with. What did he say in Mark chapter 1? The good news, the gospel of Yeshua, the Messiah, the Son of God. And so all of these testimonies are woven together to give us a picture of who Yeshua is. I'm always challenged when I look at how Scripture fulfills Scripture. In other words, what is promised in the old is fulfilled in the new, or what is revealed in the new gives us understanding of what is spoken about in the older or in the first covenant. I'm thrilled that Yeshua is the obedient son. He's the son of David. And his obedience to God, it always encourages me that Yeshua had to learn obedience, unlike the disobedient sons of David. The obedient son of God, he learned it through what he suffered. It's why he can be the sympathetic high priest, because he understands us. He's walked where we've walked. And he understands the challenges that we experience. I really would like to go over to Psalm chapter 2, because I think this is such an incredible promise. Psalms 2 verse 7. I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. And of course, we know it's fulfilled firstly in the person of David, but ultimately it's a prophecy about Yeshua. And we know that it's about Yeshua because it's quoted in Acts 13. So we're going to pop over to Acts 13 and we'll see what Luke has to say in his record of what concerns the Son of God. So chapter 13, verse 33. So Luke records these words. Let's start from verse 30, talking about Yeshua. But God raised him from the dead. And for many days, he appeared to those who had come up from him from Galilee to Jerusalem, who are now his witnesses to the people. And verse 32, and we bring you the good news that what God has promised to the fathers has been fulfilled to us, their children, by raising Yeshua. As it is written in the second Psalm, you're my son, today I have begotten you. So really what the writer here is telling us is that Psalm 2, you're my son, today I have begotten you, is not just about David. It is ultimately about Yeshua. And of course, it's also quoted in Hebrews 1 verse 5. And in Hebrews 1 verse 5, it's about the superiority that Yeshua as the Son has over the angels. And again, it ties back in with the calling of Yeshua as his high priest, because in Hebrews 5 verse 5, we read something similar. So Messiah did not exalt himself to be made high priest, but it was appointed to him by him who said, you are my son, today I have begotten you. In other words, Yeshua did not take to himself a ministry that was not given to him. He took the ministry that was appointed to him by the Father in heaven. And so that is a reference that is worth noting. Much has said and much has been written about Psalm 2, a coronation hymn for David's throne. But when we look at the way these verses are used in the New Testament, we see that it can only be no mere human descendant of David. It must be the Messiah himself. In Luke 4, we have an account of something that happened before Yeshua left Capernaum for Jerusalem. He's been preaching in the area, he's been healing the sick, but also setting them free from demons. And I want to focus on their response. When Yeshua deals in deliverance and he sets the people free, it's worth turning to Luke chapter 4 and having a quick look at what happens. So down in verse 31, he's in Capernaum. He is preaching on the Shabbat, and the people were astonished. Firstly, because of the authority of his word, but also because there, right in the synagogue, is a man with an unclean spirit. And in verse 34, we read what he cries. And in verse 34 of chapter 4 in Luke, the demon says, "What have you to do with us, Yeshua of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And further down, we read in verse 41, again, it's the demons. They're upset. They're screaming in pain because they know what is about to happen to them. Verse 41 of chapter 4. And demons came out of many crying, "You are the Son of God." And Yeshua rebuked them and would not allow them to speak because they knew who he was. And Yeshua was not yet ready to reveal who he was. And so he rebukes them for making a declaration of what is true, that he is the promised Son of God. This prophecy is, at least I think for me, I hope it is for you. It's almost as if God presents us with a prophecy and it's all wrapped up and tied with a pretty bow. And we undo the bow and we unpack to look at the riches that are inside this gift, the gift of the Son. And one of the things that for me is important to remember is we are called to be worshippers. You see, this Son is greater than the Son of David. Psalm 2 Samuel 7, verse 13 to 16, talking about David, and yet speaking about the Son of God, Yeshua. He should build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. So here we can look back to what God promised to David, an eternal throne. And we can see that it speaks not just to what David will have, but what will have and what will exist in the future, so that the Son of God, Yeshua, will fulfill it. But we're called to worship this Son because the Son is greater than David, the firstborn whom God makes manifest, the one who is not part of creation like David is, but who is the agent of creation, as we saw from Proverbs. The description of him as the firstborn is about his preeminence. And I'm going to quote Deuteronomy 32, verse 43. But I'm quoting it from the Septuagint. Why? Because it's quoted in the New Testament. And what's interesting is that there's a phrase inserted into the Septuagint that isn't in the original Tanakh. Remember that the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, was committed about 400 years, was committed into Greek from Hebrew, or translated into Greek, I should say, by 70 rabbis. At least that's so the story goes. But when they translated it, they wrote, "Rejoice, you heavens, with him. Let all of the angels worship him. Rejoice, Gentiles, with his people. Let the sons of God strengthen themselves in him." Now, if we pop over to Romans 15 and verse 10, we see this prophecy fulfilled. And again it is written, "Rejoice, O Gentiles, with his people." But if we were to go back to Deuteronomy and read it in the standard translation, the Masoretic text, we find that the word Gentiles is missing. What's written is, "Rejoice with him, O heavens, bow down with him, all gods, for he avenges the blood of his children." And the invitation in Deuteronomy 32, verse 44, in the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, according to the Masoretic text, is all of the angels are called to worship God. But in the Septuagint, we read something different. We read, not only should all the angels worship God, I'm going to quote from the Brenton translation, "Rejoice, you heavens, with him. Let all the angels of God worship him." So far, that's the same as the Masoretic text. "Rejoice, Gentiles, with his people." And that's what Paul is quoting in Romans 15, verse 10. Paul understood the verse in Deuteronomy to be messianic. Let all worship him, the one who has deity. And Paul applies this text to the worship of the Son of God, of Yeshua himself. It contrasts the angels who are servants and the Son whom they are to worship. But I would like to go back to Psalm 2, and let's open that up together and see how this passage relates Psalms chapter 2, verse 7. This is the verse that we know so well. Verse 6 says, I've set my king on Zion, my holy hill. So God is talking firstly about David, but also about the Messiah. Verse 7, I will tell of the decree the Lord has said to me, you are my son, today I've begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron. And right at the very end, there's a very intriguing invitation, or should we say command? Verse 11, serve the Lord with fear, rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Now, this verse, kiss the Son, has been challenged because apparently, if you were to read it in the Greek, you would find that the Son there is written, Greek. I've got my languages mixed up tonight. Many apologies. If you were to read this text in Hebrew, you'll find that it doesn't say Ben, it says bar. And that's a really interesting quote because bar is the Aramaic for son. But it's been argued that bar in Hebrew means pure. And the instruction to worship has been often disputed. Are we being told to kiss the Son, bar Elohim? Are we being told to worship in purity and in holiness? The ancient rabbis chose to believe that this was messianic and that the best translation was to worship, to kiss the Son. Because if you look at the whole chapter in Psalms 2, it is about the promised Son. And so it makes more sense. The Jewish community, the modern Jewish community, say that the translation kiss the Son is a Christian insertion that is inappropriate. And unfortunately, they want to justify that. Now, I found that to be sad because the ancient writers, Ibn Ezra and others, choose to recognize in this verse the sonship of the one who is promised. We've seen from Deuteronomy chapter 32, the way that Paul in Romans 15:10 takes the reading not from the Masoretic, the Hebrew text, but from the Greek text, the text that he was most familiar with, being a speaker of Greek. And he wants to point out that the verse is messianic. It points to Jesus. And when we look at verse 2, we are being challenged about how we are to worship the Son. And really, ultimately, I think that's one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about tonight, is how we relate to the promised Son. Isaiah 9 presents the Son as the spiritual solution to the physical turmoil that exists in the world. And Psalm 2 tells us that we should serve the Lord with fear, with trembling. And then there is this very interesting request, invitation, command perhaps, that we should kiss the Son lest he be angry and we perish on the way. But blessed are those who put their trust in him. It is a beautiful promise. Blessed are those who put their trust in him. When I looked at this some years ago, I was doing a series on the Song of Songs. And so I'm going to take an unusual tack, and I'd like us to pop over to Song of Songs. Chapter 1. And just read verses 1 and 2. The most beautiful song by Solomon. And in this song, the bride will confess her love. And she says, let him kiss me over and over again. Your love is better than wine. We've been called to worship, but how are we to worship? The Song of Songs in Jewish tradition is a love song, a love story between the divine bridegroom, God, and the bride, Israel. And it's often read at Passover. God is pictured as the bridegroom, as a warrior who pursues his bride, bringing her to Sinai, where he marries her under the canopy, the huppah. And the Torah is the result with the wedding contract. In Song of Songs, what is the bride asking for? People are commanded to worship the sun, just as they are commanded to worship the Lord, Yod He Vav He. In John 5, verse 23, we read that all may honor the Son, even as they honor the Father. But the bride is asking in Song of Solomon's, of course, for a kiss from the king. And interestingly, while I've been in Berlin, I've been reminded of a song by Godfrey Bertel. Just one touch from the king changes everything. And it reminded me of how God meets us in the place of our need. And I'd been at a conference and we had been singing this song by Godfrey Bertel over and over again. It was like an anthem for the conference. And it was a prayer for revival and how just one touch from the king changes everything. And I was on the train going home from the conference and I was exhausted. And I was writing a talk that I had to give. And I dozed off to sleep. And as I dozed off, I was just thinking about this amazing song, A Touch from the King Changes Everything. And I don't know if it was I guess it was a dream. I'm not quite sure what happened, but I'm sitting on the train and my eyes are closed. I'm in that place between being awake and being asleep. And as I was resting, I felt someone walk towards me. And I got the shock of my life because as the person walked towards me, they kissed me on my forehead. I opened my eyes and I looked around and there was no one there. And I knew that in some way, something of the presence of Yeshua had come and had touched me. And as many of you know, I've got a list of health problems as long as my arm, but never mind. But for 6 months, I never wheezed, I had no asthma, and all of the pain I have from fibromyalgia disappeared entirely. And God was teaching me something in that moment, that what we need is that touch from the King. And when I did this series on Song of Solomon, it was so encouraging because I realized that our words of love towards God find a home in his heart. But as we look at this, it reminds me that God's kiss, what it means, it's a life-giving kiss. In the Song of Songs, the maiden is expressing the cry of what every human soul yearns for. It is for that deep, intimate demonstration of love, and how the one in Song of Solomon, the bride who receives the kiss, it tells her how the king feels about her. There's, in this kiss the son, I remember thinking, when you look at it, we are being told or invited by God to give that demonstration of love, however that looks like for each of us, to God, to the Son. It is about revealing the heart of the giver. I don't know about you, but I only kiss the people that I feel deeply connected to. And so if I meet a family member, I give them a kiss. There are believers who I feel incredibly close to, and I will happily and with great delight when I greet them, give them a kiss. Kiss on the cheek, of course. But a kiss is intended as a greeting to convey something: warmth, intimacy, friendship, fellowship. And in the Song of Songs, the maiden extols the king's love, and how, as she thinks about the love that the king has for her, it arouses her desire for the king. And I think there's a spiritual parallel here for us, that the king, the God who is Lord of Lords and King of Kings, who's made himself known to us in the person of his Son, wants to demonstrate intimacy with us through his life-giving kiss. And I wondered what that meant. And I thought about creation. When God created Adam and Eve, they were not truly living beings until he blew his breath into their mouth. And that has often been called the divine kiss. The moment at which God, as it were, gives artificial respiration to Adam and Eve. He allows them to live because his breath has entered their hearts, their lives, and they become living beings. And I thought about how when we are born again, there is a divine kiss of life. Just as God gave the kiss of life to Adam and Eve, and they became living beings because he breathed his ruach, his breath into them, so too, at the moment we are born again, we receive the divine kiss. When God breathes into us the Spirit of God, and we become alive. Just as Adam and Eve received the breath of life, it's what made them truly alive, because they received the Spirit of God, and we are called to experience something similar. I found a story by Mike Bickle that I really appreciated. And it was the story of a concert pianist who'd longed all of his life to play in the Great Hall in Vienna. And when he finished his first concert before thousands of people, he received this incredibly long standing ovation. Afterwards, he was asked, was this really the greatest moment in your life, to play here and to receive this applause? And the pianist said, no, I liked the applause, but it wasn't the most important thing to me. And he said that when all of the people sat down, an elderly man who sat in the top corner of a balcony simply nodded his head to me. That was the greatest moment of my life, because he was the master who taught me for 30 years. One nod from him was worth more than the long applause of the masses. And the parallel for us is that one touch from God is worth more than anything the world can offer. When we're called to kiss the Son, God is calling us to love him and to passionately serve him. This invitation to kiss the Son challenges us to express to him our adoration in worship. And don't forget, God hates the lukewarm heart in Revelations 3:16. But because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. The call to kiss the Son commits us to a life of obedience to the word, where we circumcise our hearts. Deuteronomy 10 verse 16, we're told what the circumcision of the heart means. Don't be stubborn. In other words, stop rebelling against me. The circumcision of the heart is about removing from our hearts and lives those things that hold us back, that make us stubborn and rebellious. And when I wrote it, I had actually 4 C's. Kiss the Son has a call. It has a challenge. It commits us, but it challenges us to circumcise our hearts also. Romans 2 verse 29 tells us that circumcision is a matter of the heart by the Spirit, not the letter. And as I run over time and must come to an end, the spiritual solution to the physical turmoil is the Son. I wanted us tonight to think about what that means for us today, how we are to relate to the Son, how these prophecies are not just academic truths to give us greater knowledge, but they are spiritual truths to draw us into deeper relationship. And so when I wanted to look at the sonship of Yeshua here and the promise, there were all kinds of directions that you could go. But I wanted to bring it back to our lives and how we are to relate to this Son. We are to give him our all and to serve him. And we will discover the life-giving touch that he gives to us when he kisses us with his Spirit. He breathes his life into us so that we can live for him. I'm going to end there and hope that this has been an encouragement to you tonight.